What if one sentence spoken calmly on live TV was powerful enough to silence a room, infuriate a former president, and ignite a national movement? That's exactly what happened when Jasmine Crockett said this about Melania Trump's immigration history. But this wasn't just a political moment, it became something much bigger. Stay with us, because by the end of this story you might just see leadership, truth, and courage in a whole new way. The hearing room in Washington was electric, with tension like a storm about to break. Lawmakers sat behind their polished wooden desks, voices sharpened for sound bites, prepared for another day of political theater. The atmosphere was familiar, loud accusations dressed in patriotism, pointed fingers wrapped in legal jargon. And then came a pause. A silence so complete it might have been mistaken for reverence. But it wasn't reverence, it was shock. At the center of it all sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, her posture, upright eyes, steady voice, calm. She had already endured a cascade of passive-aggressive questioning, her love of country, her loyalty to the Constitution, even her right to be seated in that chamber, had all been put under a microscope by colleagues who didn't ask questions to understand, but to attack. What happened next wasn't an outburst, it wasn't rage, it was something far more powerful. In response to a thinly veiled suggestion from a male colleague about certain people needing to prove their American values, Jasmine tilted her head slightly, like she was adjusting her vision, not her message. And then, with a voice that cut through the din like a blade through fog, she said, "Congressman, would you like to revisit the visa history of Mrs. Melania Trump before we talk about who belongs in this country?" The room froze. For a second, it felt like the walls inhaled. Her words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They landed with the weight of years of hypocrisy, of unspoken truths, of selective outrage that had too often gone unchallenged. No one expected her to bring up Melania, certainly not by name, and absolutely not in such a clear, direct reference to the First Lady's own murky past as an immigrant who reportedly worked in the US before securing a legal work visa. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean into the microphone for drama. She just let the silence do the heavy lifting. It wasn't a smear. It wasn't even an accusation. It was a mirror. And suddenly a whole line of questioning that had been designed to corner her began folding in on itself. Onlookers in the room shifted in their seats. Some smiled quietly, others averted their eyes. The panel moderator cleared their throat, trying to move forward as if the air hadn't just shifted. But it had, because in less than 10 words Jasmine Crockett had named the thing nobody else dared to name, that some people's foreign roots are treated as threats, while others are wrapped in silk and celebrated. That legal and illegal are wielded not as standards, but as weapons depending on who you are. The clip hit Twitter within minutes, 30 seconds of poise and precision that burned hotter than any viral rant. People didn't just watch it, they felt it. The power of being unapologetically calm in the face of subtle cruelty. The elegance of standing your ground without stomping your feet. Jasmine didn't stay for the cameras afterward. She left the hearing room with the same grace she walked in with, quietly, directly, purposefully. But in her wake, she left a question that would echo far beyond those Capitol walls. Why is truth so threatening when spoken softly? The moment Jasmine Crockett's words echoed beyond the hearing room, the storm that followed was both swift and merciless. Within an hour, headlines blazed across conservative media outlets. Crockett attacks Melania Trump's immigration status, disrespect on Capitol Hill, radical Congresswoman targets First Lady. But what really fanned the flames wasn't the media alone, it was Donald Trump himself. From his estate in Mar-a-Lago, Trump took to truth, social with the fire and fury he was known for. Disgusting and disgraceful, he wrote. Jasmine Crockett is a nobody who just insulted the First Lady of the United States. Total loser. She should resign or be removed from Congress. Within minutes, the post was shared thousands of times. His supporters mobilized immediately, flooding Crockett's social media with vitriol threats and demands for apology. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She could have gone on the defensive. She could have issued a clarifying statement or tried to soften her words. Instead, she quietly posted the full video of the exchange to her official YouTube channel. No commentary, no dramatic music, no emotional narration, just the raw footage of what had been said. And in doing so, she allowed the truth to speak for itself. The contrast between the fury of Trump's reaction and Jasmine's calm response became the story. While cable news panels debated whether her comment was uncivil, millions of Americans were watching the clip and asking themselves a different question: why was what she said considered an attack? She hadn't insulted Melania's character. She had asked a question rooted in documented facts, long sidestepped for the comfort of political convenience. The social media divide lit up. On one side, people parroted Trump's accusations, claiming that Jasmine had crossed a line. On the other, a growing movement began to rise. Crockett was right trended on Twitter. Young immigrants, law students, and naturalized citizens posted videos sharing their own stories of scrutiny, fear, and double standards. "I've been here 15 years, one wrote. I'm still fighting to be seen as American enough." But Melania's paperwork was never questioned. Why not, amid the chaos, Jasmine returned to Capitol Hill the next morning as if nothing had changed? But everything had. She was no longer just a rising star in progressive politics. She had become something rarer, a woman who said something that couldn't be ignored and didn't try to take it back when the heat turned up. That afternoon, standing before a group of high school students visiting from Oakland, she took questions, as she always did. One young girl nervously raised her hand and asked, "Are you scared when people like Trump come after you?" Jasmine smiled, her eyes soft but firm. "I'm more scared of what happens if we all stay silent." She knew the machine would keep roaring. She knew more attacks would come. But she also knew that moments like these moments where truth broke through the noise were exactly what she was elected for. Not to perform, not to pander, but to push the conversation forward, even if the ground shook beneath her while doing it. What began as a sharp question during a hearing soon became a point of personal reflection for millions. The video of Jasmine Crockett calmly referencing Melania Trump's visa history had been viewed over 18 million times within a week. But unlike most viral political moments, this one didn't fade into meme culture or devolve into partisan mockery. It went deeper, it stuck, and it resonated in the places where real people were still fighting to be seen. Across the country, people began to respond, not with outrage, but with stories. In San Diego, a Filipino nurse named Maria posted a video of herself reading from her citizenship exam study guide, her voice shaking. She'd been living in the US for 22 years, raising a family, paying taxes, and working double shifts through the pandemic. "I've never committed a crime," she said, "but I still worry every time my visa is up for renewal." What makes me less American than her? In Minneapolis, a high school teacher used Jasmine's hearing clip as part of a civics lesson. Students were asked to analyze the moment not just for its political implications, but for what it revealed about public perception bias and the power of tone in public discourse. She didn't yell, one student noted, she just told the truth, and that made people angrier than if she'd screamed. Jasmine herself leaned into this shift. She began receiving letters handwritten and emailed from families facing deportation, from young dreamers navigating a system that seemed to move the finish line every year, and from citizens who had never thought about immigration until that moment hit them in the gut. Rather than let the moment pass, she made a quiet choice. She traveled. No press tour, no PR stunt, just a series of meetings with people who had reached out one by one. She visited a community college in Arizona where she sat with undocumented students and listened to their stories. In Atlanta, she met with black immigrants from Nigeria, Haiti, and Eritrea who described the double burden of racism and anti-immigrant sentiment. In New York, she held a closed-door roundtable with service members, green card holders, who had fought for a country that still hadn't fully embraced them. The same strength she had shown in the hearing room Jasmine brought to each of these spaces, but it was a different kind of strength, not defensive, not performative, just present. She didn't talk over anyone. She let the silence breathe. She let their stories rise. When asked why she didn't do more interviews, she simply said, "I don't need to tell the story. The people already are." The quiet dignity of her approach began to inspire others. A coalition of immigration attorneys offered pro bono consultations in Crockett's name. A group of veterans began a petition to demand automatic citizenship for non-citizen service members. And in Houston, a group of high school students started a storytelling project titled Equal Belonging, collecting oral histories of immigrant families living in the U.S. It was clear this wasn't about one question anymore. It was about a truth too long ignored. Jasmine Crockett had spoken it softly, but the echo was growing louder by the day. As the nation debated and digested the ripple effects of Jasmine Crockett's quiet defiance, something unexpected happened. Journalists, researchers, and even immigration attorneys began revisiting a question that had circulated in whispers for years, but never found a mainstream pulse. What do we actually know about Melania Trump's immigration journey? It wasn't about scandal-mongering. It wasn't about personal attack. It was about fairness and the glaring imbalance in how immigration stories are scrutinized based on the person attached to them. If millions of immigrants were expected to live under a microscope, why had Melania's path been largely accepted without question? Enter Maya Dandridge, a former immigration officer turned whistleblower. In an exclusive interview with a mid-sized investigative outlet, Maya explained that years ago, during the early months of the Trump presidency, internal questions were raised about Melania Trump's visa status, specifically about the legality of the modeling work she reportedly did in New York before securing her proper work authorization. According to Maya, a quiet inquiry had been opened, and just as quickly shut down. No one wanted to be the one who asked that question out loud, she said, not in that climate. As the story gained traction, a Freedom of Information Act request filed by a legal nonprofit finally unearthed documents that, while heavily redacted, seemed to confirm timeline inconsistencies. It was far from conclusive proof of wrongdoing, but enough to reignite a very real, very public conversation about who gets the benefit of the doubt in America's immigration system. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't seize the moment to say, "I told you so." Instead, she did something that caught even her critics off guard. She introduced a new bipartisan bill focused on transparency for high-profile immigration applicants, not naming names, not drawing attention to any one person, but laying out a framework to ensure that every immigration story, even the most privileged, is subjected to the same level of scrutiny as those struggling just to stay. She called the bill the Equal Standards Act. In a statement on the House floor, she said, "This is not about punishing individuals, it's about restoring public trust in a system that too often bends for the powerful and breaks the rest of us." The press tried to bait her. "Is this about Melania?" they asked, again and again. Her response never changed. "This is about all the people who don't have a platform." And people noticed. Polls began to shift. Even moderate voters who initially questioned Crockett's comments began expressing admiration for her grace under pressure. More importantly, she was becoming a role model for a generation of women who had grown up watching the rules applied unequally. A single mother in Detroit wrote, "I watched Jasmine and thought, that's how you do it. Not with rage, but with truth. Not by shouting, but by standing still and refusing to move when someone tries to push you down." That truth, that strength, wasn't just rewriting the political narrative, it was rewriting the cultural one. And as more facts emerged, one thing became clear. The real story was never about Melania Trump. It was about the system that protects her and punishes so many others. It would have been easy for Jasmine Crockett to let the moment pass, to count the viral video and the media storm as a victory and move on. But that was never her intention. From the beginning, her quiet challenge wasn't about headlines, it was about truth. And truth, she believed, should never stop at exposure. It should build something lasting. So she started small. She began working closely with advocacy groups across the country to gather the stories of immigrant youth, those often left out of the policy discussions altogether. Dreamers, asylum seekers, undocumented high school students. She met with them virtually and in person, not as a lawmaker, speaking down from a podium, but as a listener sitting across a table. Their stories, she said, helped her craft not just better policies, but better questions. And then came the idea that would define the next chapter of her movement. In a closed-door strategy session, someone joked, Melania's from Slovenia, I wonder if anyone there even knows this story. The room laughed softly, but Jasmine didn't. She leaned in, smiled, and said, what if we sent a different message back to where it all began? A month later, a new initiative was announced, the Sevnica Scholarship, named after Melania Trump's hometown in Slovenia. Funded entirely by private American donors, the scholarship would be awarded each year to a Slovenian student with an immigrant background who planned to study civil rights law or public service in the United States. The twist: each recipient would be paired with a US student from a similar background, creating a year-long mentorship across borders. The idea was bold, unexpected, and wildly successful. Donations poured in from all 50 states. Some came from wealthy supporters. Others came from small, handwritten envelopes with $5 bills inside. It wasn't about shame. It was about symmetry. About using one name that once sparked outrage to ignite something empowering. By the end of the year, Jasmine stood on a stage in Chicago to deliver the closing keynote for the National Youth Leadership Forum. Her speech was titled, "Courage is Quiet Until It Isn't." She spoke not just of what she said in the hearing room, but of what followed: the fury, the lies, the threats, and also the letters, the children, the families who stopped her on the street to say thank you for saying what I couldn't. She closed with a story of a young girl in Phoenix whose family had lived in fear of deportation for years. After watching Jasmine's video, she wrote in her journal, "Maybe I'm not the problem. Maybe the problem is silence." And Jasmine looked out at the audience that night and said, "She's right. Silence is the problem, and truth. Truth is always the beginning of the fix." As she left the stage, the standing ovation lasted longer than her speech, because by now people weren't clapping for a viral clip. They were clapping for something else, for the realization that one quiet question, delivered with strength and integrity, had cracked open a conversation the country could no longer ignore. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just challenged hypocrisy, she'd transformed it into hope. Jasmine Crockett didn't yell, she didn't storm out or stage a protest. She simply asked a question, direct, honest, undeniable, and in doing so, she held up a mirror to a nation that often flinches at its own reflection. What began as a measured comment during a congressional hearing referencing Melania Trump's immigration history exploded into a firestorm. Donald Trump's fury turned it into a headline. The media frenzy tried to twist her intent, but Jasmine never lost her focus. She didn't retreat and she didn't retaliate. Instead, she stood still in her truth, letting grace and facts do the work that noise never could. And then something powerful happened. People listened, from immigrant families in border towns to high school students in big cities. Jasmine's courage struck a chord. It wasn't about attacking a former First Lady. It was about naming the double standard, about saying out loud what so many people had whispered for too long, that the rules change depending on who's being judged, and that silence helps inequality survive. But Jasmine didn't stop at making a point. She built on it. She traveled the country, met with communities living under the weight of this system. She introduced legislation not to punish individuals, but to make immigration more transparent and fair. And in a gesture full of quiet brilliance, she helped launch a scholarship in Melania Trump's own hometown, turning conflict into connection, controversy into opportunity. By the time she delivered her speech titled, "Courage is Quiet Until It Isn't," it was clear this wasn't about politics anymore. It was about purpose, and that leads us to the deeper lesson. Real power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers and still gets heard. In a world addicted to noise, outrage, and performance, Jasmine Crockett reminded us that clarity is more powerful than volume, that the truth doesn't need a megaphone if it's rooted in justice, and that even the most uncomfortable questions, when asked with courage, can shift the way a society sees itself. So how can you apply this lesson? Start small. When you see a double standard, name it. When you hear someone being silenced, listen harder. When your moment comes to speak, do it not for applause, but because the truth deserves a voice. You don't need a title to create change. You just need the nerve to ask the question nobody else will. Here's a question for you. Which kind of leadership do you believe inspires real change? A loud voices and bold confrontation. B. Steady courage and quiet truth. Drop your answer in the comments, A or B, and tell us why. We want to hear your voice. Your thoughts matter. And now we'd love to know, what did Jasmine's story mean to you? Did it challenge your perspective? Did it give you hope? Leave a comment below so others can learn from your insight and maybe find the courage to share their own. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something inside you, please hit subscribe. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light, stories that remind us what strength, integrity, and leadership really look like. Thanks for being here. Stay thoughtful, stay brave, and keep asking the questions that matter.